Kaliningrad was once designed to be Russia's iron fortress in the Baltic, a heavily armed military outpost surrounded by NATO territory, packed with missile systems, fighter aircraft, radar stations, naval infantry, and one of the densest concentrations of Russian firepower in Europe. For years, the Kremlin used it as a warning to NATO, a symbol of intimidation, a forward operating base built for confrontation. But then the war in Ukraine changed everything. As casualties mounted and pressure intensified on the front lines, Moscow made a decision that may reshape the balance of power in the Baltic for years to come. Thousands of troops were quietly pulled out, elite units disappeared, air defense systems vanished from their positions. Even Kaliningrad's defensive shield began to crack. Now, satellite images are revealing something alarming. The fortress is no longer fully protected. NATO sees it, Poland sees it, Lithuania sees it, and what happens next could trigger the most dangerous military standoff in the Baltic since the Cold War. Putin's gamble in Ukraine created a military vacuum few expected to see this quickly. At the center of that vacuum is Kaliningrad. For decades, the Russian enclave served as Moscow's military spear pointed directly at NATO's eastern flank. Positioned between Poland and Lithuania along the Baltic Sea, Kaliningrad gave Russia enormous strategic leverage. From here, Moscow could threaten shipping lanes, project missile coverage deep into Europe, and pressure NATO forces across the region. But once the war in Ukraine escalated into a grinding attritional conflict, priorities changed. Russia needed manpower. It needed equipment. It needed experienced combat units capable of reinforcing collapsing sectors along the Ukrainian front. And so the Kremlin began stripping forces from Kaliningrad. The most significant withdrawal involved the 11th Army Corps, an elite formation specifically built to defend the enclave. Thousands of highly trained troops were redirected toward Ukraine. Armored equipment followed. Artillery followed. Even advanced air defense systems began disappearing from their positions. What military analysts noticed next was alarming. Satellite imagery from the Finnish border region showed Russian bases nearly empty. Entire garrisons appeared abandoned. Storage yards once packed with military vehicles now looked deserted. According to regional intelligence assessments, some installations retained barely 20% of their original personnel. That mattered because these were not secondary units. These were the very forces Russia would normally rely on to defend its northwestern frontier in the event of confrontation with NATO. And this is where the situation became dangerous. NATO officials began openly questioning Moscow's long-standing narrative. For years, the Kremlin justified military expansion by claiming the alliance posed a direct threat to Russian security. But now Russia itself was dismantling defenses along NATO borders to sustain operations in Ukraine. To many analysts, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. If Moscow truly feared an imminent NATO attack, why weaken Kaliningrad? But that was only the beginning. The withdrawals extended beyond infantry formations. British defense intelligence later confirmed that some S-400 missile defense systems had also been relocated away from Kaliningrad toward the Ukrainian battlefield. That development stunned military observers. The S-400 is one of Russia's most advanced air defense systems. Its presence in Kaliningrad helped create what strategists call an anti-access bubble, a zone capable of threatening NATO aircraft across large portions of Poland and the Baltic region. Removing those systems signaled something extraordinary. Russia was accepting additional risk in Kaliningrad because the war in Ukraine had become more urgent. At the same time, naval infantry brigades stationed in the enclave were also deployed to combat operations. Many suffered devastating losses. Reconstitution efforts are now expected to take years. And then came the moment nobody expected. By early 2026, even Russia itself appeared to recognize the growing vulnerability. Satellite imagery revealed construction of new protective aircraft shelters at critical military airfields near Kaliningrad. The shelters were clearly designed to defend aircraft from potential drone strikes. That detail mattered enormously, because it meant Moscow no longer viewed Kaliningrad as untouchable. The fortress was now preparing for survival. The Pentagon and NATO had been watching every development carefully, because Kaliningrad is not just another Russian territory, it is one of the most strategically sensitive military positions in Europe. For years, Western planners feared the enclave could become the launch point for rapid Russian escalation in the Baltic region. Iskander missile systems based there can strike targets across much of Eastern Europe. Russian naval forces operating from the enclave once played a major role in controlling Baltic Sea access routes. But the war in Ukraine forced Moscow into an increasingly dangerous balancing act. Every troop sent to Ukraine weakened another sector of Russia's broader military posture, and NATO understood exactly what that meant. Poland moved first. Warsaw began implementing one of the largest border fortification projects Europe has seen in decades. Massive anti-tank barriers, defensive trench systems, camouflaged bunkers, mine infrastructure, surveillance systems. The message was unmistakable. Poland no longer viewed Kaliningrad as an unstoppable military fortress. It viewed it as a contained threat. But the military dimension was only one layer of the response. Intelligence operations intensified as well. Russian diplomatic facilities inside Poland were gradually shut down amid accusations of espionage activity. Western counterintelligence agencies increasingly targeted Russian surveillance networks linked to Baltic operations. And this is where the strategic pressure deepened. Kaliningrad depends heavily on external supply routes: fuel, food, construction materials, industrial goods, rail transit, energy connections. Most of those routes pass through NATO territory. Lithuania understood the leverage this created. Tensions exploded when transit restrictions began affecting the movement of sanctioned Russian goods through Lithuanian territory. Moscow issued threats. Russian officials warned of consequences, but Lithuania held its ground under NATO protection. The Kremlin suddenly faced a reality it had long tried to avoid. Kaliningrad could be pressured without a single NATO missile being fired. What happened next changed everything. The Baltic states accelerated plans to integrate more deeply with European infrastructure systems while reducing reliance on Soviet-era networks. Rail modernization projects threatened to physically isolate Russian transport access in the future. Energy systems were also shifting. For decades, Kaliningrad benefited from interconnected Soviet electrical grids spanning multiple countries. But as Baltic states synchronized with European networks, the enclave increasingly became an isolated energy island. Russia attempted to compensate using LNG shipments and emergency infrastructure. But there was a problem. Sea transport is expensive, vulnerable, slow, weather-dependent, and now the Baltic Sea itself had transformed strategically. With Finland and Sweden joining NATO structures, Russia's operational freedom in the region narrowed dramatically. Western naval surveillance expanded, air patrols intensified, electronic monitoring increased. Military analysts began describing the Baltic as a NATO-controlled operational environment. That creates enormous complications for Russia, because sustaining Kaliningrad during prolonged tension or crisis becomes significantly harder when surrounding sea lanes are constantly monitored by NATO forces. Meanwhile, reports emerged that drone threats had already triggered emergency responses at airports inside the enclave itself. For the first time since the war began, Kaliningrad experienced visible signs of insecurity in its own airspace. The psychological impact was enormous. The fortress that once threatened Europe was now reinforcing shelters against drones. Now the geopolitical consequences are beginning to unfold. Kaliningrad is no longer simply a military asset. It is becoming a strategic burden. And that may be one of the most important shifts of the entire Ukraine war. For years, Russia projected strength from the enclave. The Baltic Fleet operated as a regional intimidation tool. Missile deployments pressured NATO capitals. Electronic warfare systems disrupted military exercises. But sustaining power requires more than weapons. It requires logistics. It requires economic stability. It requires functioning infrastructure. And this is where the pressure is intensifying. Transportation costs inside Kaliningrad have surged dramatically. Industrial production has slowed. Supply chains remain disrupted. Businesses are struggling under sanctions and transport bottlenecks. Many younger professionals have already left: doctors, engineers, IT specialists. A growing brain drain is quietly reshaping the region. But the Kremlin cannot simply walk away. Kaliningrad holds enormous symbolic value for Russia. Abandoning it would be politically unthinkable. Militarily, it still provides strategic access to the Baltic Sea. Nuclear-capable missile systems remain stationed there. And that creates the dangerous paradox. Russia must continue defending the enclave, even while the war in Ukraine consumes resources needed to sustain it. Military analysts increasingly warn that this dilemma could become far more severe if the Ukraine conflict drags on for years. Because every additional deployment toward Ukraine creates new vulnerabilities elsewhere. And NATO understands that time may now be working in its favor. But that does not make the situation safer. In fact, it may make it more unpredictable. History shows that states under strategic pressure sometimes become more aggressive, not less. The risk of military miscalculation increases when nations feel cornered, and Kaliningrad remains heavily militarized despite its growing weaknesses. That means any future incident in the Baltic region, a drone strike, a naval confrontation, an airspace violation, an intelligence operation gone wrong, could escalate rapidly under conditions of extreme distrust. And then came another alarming realization. Even Russia's alternative supply strategy through maritime routes carries enormous risk. Winter ice conditions, storms, NATO naval monitoring, and logistical bottlenecks all complicate sea resupply efforts. A prolonged regional crisis could place immense pressure on the enclave's economy and military readiness simultaneously. This is why Western defense planners continue monitoring Kaliningrad so closely. Because beneath the headlines lies a much larger question. What happens when a military fortress slowly transforms into a strategic liability? What happens when the very territory designed to project strength begins consuming strength instead? The answer could reshape the future security architecture of the Baltic region, and possibly Europe itself. Kaliningrad was once one of Moscow's most feared military strongholds, a forward fortress meant to intimidate NATO and project Russian dominance across the Baltic. But the war in Ukraine changed the equation. Troops were withdrawn, air defenses weakened, supply routes narrowed, economic pressure intensified, and now the enclave that once symbolized Russian power is showing visible signs of strain. Yet despite all of this, the danger has not disappeared, because heavily armed regions under pressure are often the most unpredictable. The Baltic is entering a new phase of tension. NATO is watching closely, Russia is trying to hold the line, and every new development raises the stakes even further. So the question now is no longer whether Kaliningrad is vulnerable. The real question is what Moscow might do if that vulnerability continues to grow.